Anomaly Rising, The Unseen Threat. Chapter 1. Embarking on the mission. The year was 2268, and the Earth was on the brink of collapse. After decades of environmental destruction, overpopulation, and political turmoil, the planet was no longer able to sustain life. The only hope for humanity was to find a new home among the stars. The United Nations Space Agency had been working on a solution for years. Finally, after countless failed attempts, they had developed a way to travel faster than the speed of light. The plan was simple. Send a crew of astronauts to explore the nearest habitable planet, and if possible, establish a new colony there. The mission, dubbed Project Exodus, was the most important undertaking in human history. The crew consisted of the best and brightest, hand-picked from around the world. Captain Tom Richards sat in the cockpit of the USS Odyssey, the most advanced spacecraft ever built. He examined the systems one last time, ensuring everything was in working order. His crew waited in the cabin behind him, nervous but ready for the journey ahead. "Are you ready?" he asked, turning to face the others. They nodded in unison, exuding determination and resolve. "Then let's get this bird off the ground," he said, and with that, he hit the ignition button. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off the ground. The Earth disappeared from view as they soared into the atmosphere. The trip to their destination planet would take 6 months, during which they would pass through a cryogenic sleep. The crew would be placed in pods, frozen in time, and awakened upon arrival. Richards had spent the last few months training for this moment, mentally and physically preparing himself for the journey that lay ahead. He glanced over at the planet Earth, now nothing more than a small orb in the distance. A sudden jolt rocked the ship, and the alarms started blaring. "What the hell was that?" Richards shouted, his heart racing. The crew looked at him for answers, but he had none to give. The Odyssey had been designed to withstand the rigors of space travel, so this could only mean one thing: they were under attack. Richards sprang into action, accessing the ship's systems and running diagnostics. The data showed that they had been hit by a laser beam, but there was no sign of the attacker. What kind of weapons could do that? Wendy, the ship's weapons specialist, asked. "I don't know," Richards replied, his voice laced with urgency. "But we need to find out." He ordered the crew to scan the area, looking for any signs of another ship. They searched for hours but found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, a massive ship appeared on the radar. It looked nothing like any human-designed spacecraft they had ever seen. The ship was enormous, twice the size of the Odyssey. Richards knew they were outmatched, but he refused to back down. "Ready the cannons," he ordered. "We're not going down without a fight." The crew sprang into action, readying the ship's weapons. The enemy ship fired another laser beam, striking the Odyssey on its side. The crew stumbled as the ship shuddered violently. "Return fire!" Richards shouted. The cannons roared to life, firing a barrage of lasers at the enemy. The air was filled with the sound of explosions as the ships engaged in a deadly duel. The Odyssey was hit again, this time much harder. The ship's systems were failing, and the lower half of the vessel was breaking apart. "We're going down," Wendy yelled. "Brace for impact." The crew clamped onto anything they could find as the ship plummeted to the planet's surface below. The heat shields failed, and fire erupted all around them. Just as they were about to crash into the surface, the ship suddenly stopped. They looked out of the window and saw a massive force field encircling them. "What the hell is this?" Richards asked, but none of them had the answers. The next thing they knew, bright lights filled the cockpit, and everything went black. Chapter 2. The Unseen Force. When Captain Tom Richards came to, he found himself lying on the floor of the ship's cockpit. He groaned, clutching his head, trying to shake off the fog of unconsciousness. The ship was eerily quiet, and the lights were flickering. He could tell that their situation had gone from bad to worse. He tried to stand up, but a sharp pain shot up his leg, forcing him back down. He looked down and saw a large gash on his shin, bleeding profusely. "Is anyone there?" he yelled, hoping to receive a response. There was no answer, only silence. He tried to access the ship's systems, but most of them were down, leaving him in the dark. He reached for his communicator but found that it was gone, along with the rest of his equipment. Panic set in as he realized that he was completely cut off from the rest of the crew. He crawled towards the nearest console, desperately hoping to find something that would help him. As he shuffled through the debris, he noticed something strange. The lower half of the ship was nowhere to be seen. They had crashed, but where were they? Just then, he felt a slight vibration underfoot. He froze, listening intently. The ship was moving. He couldn't see anything outside the window, but he could feel the ship's momentum. They were being dragged somewhere, but by what? He tried the intercom, hoping to reach the rest of the crew. "Can anyone hear me?" he yelled, his voice shaking with fear. There was still no response, only static. He felt a sudden jerk, and the ship shook violently. He could hear the metal groaning under the strain. "Please, someone, help me," he muttered, his desperation growing. Just as he was about to give up hope, the ship came to a sudden stop. Richards felt himself thrown forward and slammed into the console. He groaned and sat up, rubbing his head, which now had a deep gash oozing with blood. He peered out the window and saw a strange, massive structure looming in the distance. It looked like a colossal black pyramid, surrounded by a shimmering blue force field. "What is that?" he muttered to himself, but he knew that there was no way he could find out alone. He needed to find the rest of the crew, to rally them together and come up with a plan. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg, and began to hobble his way towards the cabin. As Captain Richards made his way to the cabin, he found that it was completely destroyed. The seats were overturned, and the floors were littered with debris. The other crew members were nowhere to be found. He called out to them, but there was no answer. As he moved further into the cabin, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. All around him, equipment and supplies had been ripped apart, scattered throughout the room. "What the hell happened here?" he said to himself. He saw movement out of the corner of his eye and spun around, only to find himself face to face with something that sent shivers down his spine. A creature stood before him, towering over him at a height of at least 10 feet. Its skin was a deep shade of purple, and it had long, tentacle-like appendages where its arms should have been. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and Richards could feel the malice emanating from the creature. He stumbled backward, trying to distance himself from the creature, but he knew that he was hopelessly outmatched. The creature made a menacing move forward, and Richards thought it was the end. But in that moment, he remembered something Wendy, the weapons specialist, had said during their training. Always keep a backup. Something to protect yourself when your primary fails. He lifted his hand and pulled out a small handgun from his ankle holster. He wasn't entirely sure what he was facing or whether the weapon would have any effect, but he aimed and held his breath as he pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the creature directly in the chest, causing it to stagger back. Richards, surprised at the result, fired again and again, emptying the clip. The creature fell back, letting out a deafening roar. It rose again, its eyes glowing brighter, and suddenly a massive burst of energy erupted from its body. Richards was thrown back by the tremendous force, and the room went dark. He awoke a moment later, gasping for air, and found himself alone. The creature was gone, and so was the rest of the crew. He was alone, stranded deep in outer space, with no way to contact anyone, and no idea of what had happened to his fellow astronauts. Chapter 3. A Race Against Time. Captain Tom Richards sat alone on the deserted spaceship, his mind in a state of panic. He had no idea where the other members of his crew had gone or what had become of them. He tried to access the ship's systems, but they had all been damaged in the attack. The power was flickering intermittently, and he knew that he only had a few hours left before the life support system shut down completely. He needed to find a way to repair the ship and locate the other crew members, but he was stranded, hundreds of light years away from Earth, with no means of contacting anyone. Richards knew that he couldn't give up. He had to stay alive and find a way to rescue his crew members and complete the mission. The fate of humanity depended on him. He dragged himself across the floor, leaning on his injured leg. He made his way to the control room and checked the computer for any signs of life. The computer was flickering, but to his relief, he found that the power cell was still functioning. He quickly rerouted the power to the systems in the cockpit, and the displays flickered to life. There was no sign of the other crew members, but the ship had been damaged in the attack, and they could have been anywhere. Richards knew that he needed to act fast. The ship's air systems were failing, and he didn't have much time left. He went to work repairing the life support systems, using whatever materials he could find. He used duct tape and wires to fix the damaged wiring and found spare parts in the storage compartment. His injured leg slowed him down, but he refused to give up. He had to stay alive if he wanted to save the others. Hours passed, and he managed to repair the critical systems, extending the ship's life support for a little longer. He took a short break, wiping the sweat off his forehead, and tried to think of a plan to locate the other crew members. That's when he remembered something the engineer had mentioned during their training. "The ship has an emergency beacon," the engineer had said. "It's a last resort system we use if we get separated. If you're lost, activate it, and we'll come to you." Richards made his way to the emergency beacon, which was located in the cargo hold, and prepared to activate it. He hesitated for a brief moment. He wondered whether the aliens that had attacked the spacecraft were still out there. But all that didn't matter. He had to protect his fellow crew members. He activated the beacon, and the ship's electronics beeped as it sent out the signal. He waited for a response, but only silence answered him. In a final desperate attempt to save his fellow crew members, he decided to make an EVA out in space. He wrapped himself in a spacesuit, weapon at the ready. The moment he opened the airlock of the ship, 1,000 thoughts raced through his head. What if the aliens were waiting for him? What if he ran out of oxygen or fuel? He pushed these thoughts aside and stepped out onto the ship's surface. The ship had suffered tremendous damage, dust and debris embroiled from the crash. He observed his surroundings and noticed the large black pyramid structure which had brought them here. It was still there, surrounded by the blue force field, taunting him with its massive presence. He scanned the surroundings with what little resources he had left and saw a small blip on his radar. The blip seemed to be moving and he made his way towards it. As he got closer, he realized that it was one of the crew members, Sarah, floating in space, unconscious. Richards pulled her in, realizing that she had sustained injuries similar to his own. He was relieved to have found her, but he knew that time was running out. He dragged her into the ship and placed her in the medical bay. He knew he had to try to wake her up as soon as possible. He searched the ship for medication, but most of the medical supplies had been destroyed. All he could find was a jar of smelling salts, which he hoped would do the job. He broke the jar and held it under her nose. She stirred and slowly opened her eyes. "Tom? What happened?" she asked, confused. "We got attacked," Richards said, his voice cracking with emotion. "The ship's damaged, and we need to repair it. Can you help me?" Sarah nodded and got to work, and together they repaired the ship's engines. They worked tirelessly, and after a few hours, the engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off the ground. They had found a way to stay alive, at least for a while longer. But the questions remained unanswered. Who had attacked them? And where were the rest of the crew members? Richards knew that they were running out of time, and he realized that he was already racing against an unseen force that was closing in on them. Chapter 4. Betrayal. The journey towards the habitable planet seemed to take an eternity. The ship was on low power, and the crew worked tirelessly to repair the damaged components. Captain Richards contemplated how their mission had taken such a disastrous turn. Their plan had been simple: find a new home for humanity among the stars. But now, their mission had become a struggle for survival. As they traveled, the crew struggled to put the pieces together about what had happened to the ship. There were still questions that needed to be answered. Where were the other crew members? Who was behind the mysterious attack? But something else was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. Something that would shake the very foundations of the crew's trust in each other. One morning, while Captain Richards was inspecting the engine room, he saw on the monitors a series of transactions that had been carried out using the ship's digital currency. He realized that a considerable amount of money had been transferred to an unknown entity. Who authorized these transactions? Richards asked the others. Dead silence met his question. No one knew, and no one seemed willing to speak up. Finally, Wendy, the weapons specialist, spoke up. It must have been one of us. Captain Richards could not believe what he was hearing. He had never expected his own crew members to betray him, and yet, the evidence was staring him in the face. Sarah, the engineer, stepped forward. I noticed some strange behavior just before the attack. But I thought it was just me being paranoid. As they talked, the pieces began to fall into place. It was clear that someone on the ship had been working with the attackers, and that they had been planning their assault for some time. The realization of the betrayal hit the crew like a ton of bricks. I need to know who's responsible, Richards said, his voice low and steady. We can't have someone on board who's working against us. The others nodded in agreement, and an investigation was launched. It didn't take long before they uncovered the culprit. It was Jake, the navigation specialist. He had been the one who had transferred the funds to an unknown account, and he had been communicating with the enemy. When Jake was confronted with the evidence, he broke down and confessed to everything. The attackers had promised him immense wealth if he helped them overtake the ship. The crew was shell-shocked. They had trusted Jake, and now he had betrayed them all. What are we going to do about him? Wendy asked, her eyes showing a mixture of fear and anger. Captain Richards thought for a moment, weighing his options. He had been trained to deal with crisis situations, but he had never encountered anything like this before. The ship was still far from the habitable planet, and with resources running low, they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They needed to get rid of Jake and move forward, but the question remained: what should they do with him? There was only one option available. They would have to jettison Jake out of the airlock, leaving him to drift aimlessly in space. It was a harsh decision, but it was the only one that they could make. Survival was their top priority, and they couldn't afford any more risks. Jake was subdued and escorted to the airlock. He begged for mercy, but the crew was resolute. They couldn't afford to have a traitor among them, and their duty to humanity was too great to let any personal feelings get in the way. They opened the airlock, and Jake was sucked out into the vastness of space. The crew watched silently, their hearts heavy with the weight of their actions. They had lost one of their own due to betrayal and greed. Finally, the moment passed, and they got back to work, trying to complete their mission against all odds. They knew that they still had a long journey ahead of them, but they could face it united, knowing that they had each other's backs. They had learned an invaluable lesson that day, that when the stakes were high, betrayal could come from even the most unexpected places. Chapter 5. The ultimate sacrifice. As the ship drew closer to the habitable planet, the crew's spirits lifted. They had overcome great obstacles and had made it through everything that the universe had thrown at them. But they knew that the hardest part of their mission still lay ahead of them. They would need to land on the planet and complete a series of complex tasks to establish a human settlement. However, they were running dangerously low on supplies, and the ship's engines were on the verge of failing. They knew that they had to act fast if they were to make it to the planet safely. Sarah, the engineer, had been working around the clock to keep the engines running, but she knew that it was just a matter of time before they failed completely. The crew gathered in the cockpit, and Captain Richards addressed them. "We've come too far to turn back now. We have to give it everything we've got to make it to that planet." No one spoke, but they all knew that he was right. They proceeded with the landing, and the ship shuddered as it entered the planet's atmosphere. They were approaching the designated landing site, but something was wrong. The ship's trajectory was off, and they were headed straight towards the side of a mountain. The crew frantically tried to correct the ship's course, but it was too late. They crashed into the mountainside with a deafening thud. When Captain Richards came to, he realized that he was trapped within the cockpit, with debris blocking his way. He tried to reach for his communicator, but it was out of reach. He looked around and saw that the others were also trapped. He knew what he had to do. He had to get to the other crew members and make sure that they were okay. He had a feeling that this time, he wouldn't be able to rely on their equipment, so he had to take matters into his own hands. Slowly, through sheer willpower, he managed to dislodge the debris and move towards his crew members, calling out to them. Wendy responded weakly, "I'm over here, Tom. I'm hurt." Richards made his way towards her, and to his horror, he saw that Wendy was badly injured, with a large metal rod embedded in her abdomen. "Tom, you have to save the others," she said, her voice strained with pain. "I won't make it." Richards knew that what she was saying was true. They were running out of time, and he had to prioritize the crew's survival. He made a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He left Wendy behind, knowing that he had to act fast to save the other crew members. As he trudged on, he realized that he had no idea where he was. The crash had thrown everything into chaos, and he was disoriented. He finally saw the faint outline of a structure, and he knew that it was their best bet for shelter. He managed to crawl his way to the structure, and he slowly made his way inside. Inside, he found a large room, with what looked like a control center. He stumbled forward, reaching for the nearest console, and began to see what he could operate. He found a map of the local terrain on the screen and began to study it, looking for signs of the other crew members. He saw that one of the members, John, was lying unconscious near a lake. Richards knew that he couldn't leave him there. He knew that the terrain was treacherous, and it would be a long, arduous journey. But, without hesitation, he made the decision to set off on foot. He abandoned the shelter and set out into the wilderness. The terrain was rough, and the going was slow. The planet's sun was starting to set, and he knew that he didn't have much time left. He pushed himself beyond his limits, fighting off exhaustion and fatigue. He finally reached the lake, where he found John lying unconscious beside the shore. He carried John on his back, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his muscles. When he finally got back to the shelter, he collapsed, completely spent. He looked up and saw the other crew members, all of whom had gathered around him, looking at him with admiration and gratitude. "That was amazing what you did, Tom," Sarah said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "We're all so proud of you." It was then that he realized that he had made the ultimate sacrifice. He had left Wendy behind, and Chapter 6, Triumph after the crash landing and the traumatic events that followed, the crew was emotionally and physically drained. But they knew that they had to complete their mission. They had come too far to give up now. The crew worked tirelessly to establish a base on the planet, building shelters with the limited resources they had. Sarah used her engineering skills to set up a water filtration system, while Wendy served as the crew's medic, tending to their numerous injuries. In the weeks that followed, the crew worked hard, and slowly but surely, the base began to take shape. The planet was harsh, with extreme weather conditions and unfamiliar terrain, but they persevered, driven by the knowledge that they were working towards something greater than themselves. For the first time in months, the crew began to feel a sense of hope. They had finally made it to the planet, and they were laying the groundwork for a new human settlement. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. The crew worked tirelessly, and soon the base was fully functional, with solar panels providing power, and a greenhouse providing fresh produce. The crew had established their home on this new planet, and they had all grown closer. They had been through so much together. They no longer saw each other simply as coworkers but as family. One day, while exploring the outskirts of the base, Sarah discovered an ancient artifact. It was a small, metal object that was covered in intricate engravings. The crew gathered around her as she carefully examined the object. They were stunned when they realized that the object was the key to unlocking the planet's greatest mystery. There was a hidden chamber, a massive underground complex that had been concealed from sight for centuries. The artifact contained the coordinates and the means to access this chamber. The crew was ecstatic. They knew that this chamber would hold the key to unlocking the secrets of the planet, and they were determined to get inside. They worked tirelessly, and after days of excavation, they found an entrance to the chamber. When they finally made it inside, they were awestruck. The chamber was enormous, with walls covered in engravings and strange symbols. As they explored the chamber, they discovered something even more incredible, a device that could transport them through space and time. This device was the ultimate tool, capable of unlocking the secrets of the universe, and the crew knew that they had to use it wisely. They huddled together, discussing their options, and finally decided that they would use the device to relay their findings back to Earth. The crew knew that they were on the brink of a new dawn, a new era in human history, and they were honored to be at the forefront of this discovery. They used the device to launch their findings back to Earth, and they waited patiently for a response. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they received a message from Earth. The message was one of triumph, congratulating the crew on their incredible discovery. The crew had done it. They had found a new home for humanity. The crew was overjoyed, but they knew that their work was far from over. They had the responsibility of building a new society, of ensuring that humanity thrived in this new world. And so, with their heads held high and their hearts full of determination, the crew embarked on the next phase of their journey, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The crew had done the impossible. They had found a new home for humanity and had set the stage for a new era in human history. As the months passed, the crew worked tirelessly to build a new society on the planet. They had gained the knowledge and experience from their journey, and they were determined not to make the same mistakes that had led to the downfall of their previous civilization. The new society was founded on the principles of cooperation, equality, and sustainability. The crew had learned the hard way that these values were essential for survival. The crew members had become leaders in their own right, each playing an essential role in building this new world. They had developed a deep respect and trust for each other, forged through the trials and tribulations they had faced together. The society that they built was a marvel of engineering and ingenuity. They had harnessed the power of the planet's natural resources, and had developed clean energy sources, sustainable agriculture systems, and sophisticated communication networks. As the years passed, the crew members grew old, but their spirits remained high. They had achieved something incredible, and they knew that their legacy would live on for generations to come. But the end was fast approaching. The crew knew that their time was running out, and they began to make preparations for what was to come. One by one, each of the crew members passed away, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered for centuries. They had done the impossible, and they had succeeded. The new society continued to flourish, but it was never forgotten that it was built on the backs of pioneers. The crew had set the foundation, but it was up to the future generations to build upon it. And so, as the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, the society on the planet continued to grow and flourish. New technologies were discovered, new discoveries were made, and the knowledge that the crew had gleaned during their journey was used to further the progress of humanity. In time, the planet became a beacon of hope for all of humanity. A shining symbol of what was possible when people worked together towards a common goal. The crew members may have been long gone, but their legacy lived on. Their journey had taught them that anything was possible, that the human spirit was powerful beyond measure, and that excellence could be achieved through hard work, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in oneself. The world that they had built was one of triumph, one that would serve as a testament to the power of the human spirit, and the unending potential that lay within each and every one of us. In the end, the crew members had accomplished what they had set out to do. They had traveled through the vast, endless expanse of space, encountered unimaginable challenges, and had emerged triumphant. Their journey had come to an end, but their legacy would live on forever,